Andri Feldmann is working on his PhD at the University of Bern, and he's also a sports scientist with IDEAG, and IDEAG is our distribution partner in parts of Europe for Moxy. Andri completed his master's work at the University of British Columbia doing work with near-infrared spectroscopy. He hosts a YouTube channel called Near Sport Science, and I have posted a link to his YouTube channel in the Discord chat. You may recognize his last name Feldmann, as Andri is the son of Jörg Feldmann. Jörg was a pioneer in practical applications for near-infrared spectroscopy, using that with athletes, and he's responsible for a lot of the content, most of the content on the Moxy forum. If you've dived into that, you would recognize Jörg's work there. Andri's presentation is using muscle oxygenation to predict time to exhaustion. And this is a great example of the value of people sharing information at these summits. At least some aspects of this concept trace back to our 2017 summit that was in Seattle, where Brett Kirby from Nike gave a presentation on some work related to this concept. And I think a lot of people have taken some interest in that presentation from 2017. So this it seems like these summits are having some of the intended effect of this of sharing information among our users. So with that, we'll turn things over to Andri.
Do you see my screen? Is that right? This the PowerPoint?
We're seeing your PowerPoint. You're kind of in the edit mode right now. There you go. Now we're seeing the seeing the screen.
And you guys see me, my video cam something. You guys see my face?
Oh, yep. We've got your pretty face too. This is great.
Okay. Great. Thanks a lot. Yeah, thanks, Roger. Thanks for all the presentations so far. They've been great. I've been writing down questions. I'm definitely going to contact a bunch of people. So thank you very much. I think the first thing I have to start with is a little disclosure. So I work directly with Moxy a lot with Roger since the very beginning. So I'm definitely biased. And I work, apart from doing my PhD at the University of Bern, I work for the company IDEAG, which sells the Moxy monitor in in Europe. We use software development things and for the Moxy. So what I want to talk about, which Roger kind of mentioned, is about the relationship between task failure and muscle oxygenation. And most people think about this more as a relationship between muscle oxygenation and performance, and about modeling this data. It's actually a little bit of a say. So Chris, Dr. Cooper gave me a little segue where how he ended his presentation. So we'll kind of go into that a little bit with the systems identification. So those of you who have done the Moxy Academy courses, you'll see this picture. You'll remember this picture and this screenshot here of data. And it's one of the first things that people generally do when they get a Moxy is they put it on a muscle and they measure. And what are you going to do when you put on a muscle? Well, you're going to do a muscle contraction. And if you do an isometric muscle contraction, you get this image here that we see, which brings us to the point, well, what are we really measuring with muscle oxygenation? And Dr. Cooper already mentioned this. Lots of people have talked about this. Well, we're really measuring two things. At least this is what Perry and Ferrari highlight. The balance between oxygen supply and demand, that was already mentioned. And the second part is this regional oxygen saturation reserve capacity. So if we look at the image, we looked at Roger doing his bicep contraction. What we see here is we have a resting value that's some kind of plateau that kind of moves up and down with rest. As soon as muscle contraction happens, you get this decrease in muscle oxygenation because there's a disbalance between supply and demand. After you release the contraction, this disbalance goes in the other direction and you have a recovery. So you have this oxygen supply and demand that we have highlighted. I'm going to actually put on my little PowerPointer because that might help a little bit. So this component right here is identified by the arrows. And then we have this little area in the middle, however you want to take the integral of this. And this is some kind of oxygen reserve that we just used up doing this muscle contraction. Okay. So doing this example, what you quickly realize while you're doing it is that as your muscle oxygenation changes, you get tired. The contraction gets hard and you want to let go. So you quickly come to realize that there's some kind of relationship here between the performance output of your muscle and what's going on here with your near signal. Now, there's lots of data on this. This is a nice curve you can look at here from Imagi et al. And what they showed is that if you do this kind of static gripping, this isometric contraction, you have this curvilinear drop right here in performance. And you have a change in oxygenation. So we're going to look at this deoxy value right here, which is it goes up, and the deoxygenation goes up, and it kind of drops down again. And this explains to us kind of, well, there is some relationship between performance, what's happening here in this curvilinear pattern, and what's happening with this near signal. On a side note for everyone else, this inflection point is quite interesting. Just kind of highlights an occlusion threshold, because we were talking about occlusions. So you have this linear change, and then it starts this curvilinear change, and this is identified as you no longer have a muscle occlusion happening. It's an interesting side note, not to get off track here too far. But we have a relationship clearly between performance and what we're getting out of our near signal. Now, if there's a relationship, the question is, can we model these two things together? Can we model what's happening with performance with what's happening with muscle oxygenation? And as Roger mentioned, 2 years ago, Brett Kirby talked at the Moxie Summit. Last year, Phil Skiba talked. And listening to those kind of talks and looking at this curvilinear pattern that we have here, I think many of you will recognize what we're looking at is actually a very classical force or power time duration curve. And why is this important for us to recognize? Well, because if we want to do some kind of modeling, there's different approaches you can take to modeling. And I'm not an engineer, so I'm a sports scientist, but I'm working with some people who are better at these things than I am. And we're trying to model what we see in the physiology and in the performance and how these two things relate. And there's different ways that you can go about trying to do this modeling. And we have the spectrum here on the cyst identification modeling techniques. We have a first principle technique, and we have a data-driven technique. The first principle technique is often called like a white box. And a white box model, when you put data into this white box, and in the white box, we know exactly what's happening. It's transparent. We know all the rules that are going to dictate what the output is from the input. So something like Newtonian laws, like force equals mass times acceleration. On the other end of the spectrum, we have data-driven modeling, which is a black box modeling. We put data in. We don't actually know what's happening on the inside, and we get data back out. Now, there's a lot of tools that you can use to do this. Very complex systems are often modeled like this. The problem is they're not very satisfying because we don't actually know what's going on. You're still left with this black box, which is, in my opinion, a problem in athletics because you're putting data in, you're getting data out. And if you're getting different outputs from inputs, you don't really know why that's happening necessarily. But there's a third option, and that's you can do gray box modeling. And gray box modeling is something between the two. So if you have assumptions, or at least if you have some rules that you think dictates your model, you can plug them into this gray box, and then you can put data in and get data out, and you have some idea as to why this transformation is happening. Which gets us back to this curvilinear pattern that I was talking about. Well, we have some idea that there's a relationship between muscle oxygenation and performance. And so we got some idea as to what's going to guide our gray box. What we need for our gray box is some kind of mathematical system that's going to help us determine this relationship exactly, or close to exactly. It's a gray box. Some of the things are going to get figured out by the data. If we continue on this data track, what we're looking at here is, again, we have a nice curvilinear model, which we had before, and we have SMO2. This is a 3-minute all-out test, which many of you may have done if you do critical power testing. There's a couple of publications out there about this, that you can use a 3-minute all-out test to determine critical power and W prime. So what we see in this picture very nicely is this relationship between change in power and change in muscle oxygenation. That's why I really like this test to show this relationship. Which brings us directly to the critical power model. This is the model that Skiba and Kirby presented in the last two So in order to determine our gray box on how we're going to model the relationship between muscle oxygenation and performance, or time to task failure, which is then related to performance, we need to give our gray box some structure. And this critical power model, which we have on the right here, is going to provide us a certain degree of structure for this. And why do we think that this is going to give us some structure to this? And it has to do with this definition here of the information that the MOXIE or tissue oximeters are going to give us. So it's going to look something like this. Let's go to the next slide. Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry, a little hand there. Okay, it's going to look something like this. So for those of you that know the critical power model, the time limit, so the time you have left in your performance ability is related to W prime and to the difference in your performance to your critical power. And the way that we look at it is that this W prime has something to do with this regional O2 saturation, which is what Perry and Fari highlight as information we're getting out of the tissue oximeter. And this critical power and power difference has something to do with the balance between your oxygen supply and your oxygen demand. And so we see that there's structure here that we can use for a gray box model. And to make this a little bit easier, especially for those of you who maybe don't know the critical power model so well, you can consider your O2 saturation, the value you have, this reserve that we talked about, as some kind of battery that you have available to you. In the critical power model, it's often thought of as a battery. I think it's a good analogy, which has a limited amount of charge. When the charge is empty, your battery is empty. And the oxygen supply and demand you can think of as a charging capacity that you have. Okay? And so if you need more power than your charge capacity can give you, well, you're going to keep draining your battery. The battery won't be able to recharge. So I hope that visually that helps people think about this a little bit. One of the most important things for me that to point out now is that this link between this critical power model and what we're doing with muscle oxygenation isn't as one-to-one as I'm presenting it here. It's more the phenomenon seems to represent each other quite well, so it's a good basis to start modeling from. So this is what we did. We have an SMO2 input. As the basic initial structure, we have some idea of critical power, and our output is going to be this time limit, or better said, this battery, which is going to be in some kind of arbitrary units that we're defining. And so in order to generate our first models for this, we did a series of different tests, and this is one of the experiments that we did. We took 20 participants, and they did knee extensions. And they did knee extensions, 4 different tests of knee extensions. One was a maximal intensity test, an MVC. And then they did constant workload knee extensions at 5, 10, and 20% of their maximal intensity. And they did all of these knee extensions to failure. This was set up with failure conditions and with a metronome with the same same rate of extensions and constant workload. And we did all of these tests in two conditions. We did them in a normal condition, which I'm going to call normal, and we did them in an occluded condition. So we tied off their leg, so like a closed system, and we measured NIRS on the different muscle heads of the quadricep, and we measured performance in EMG and so on. And what we got out of this, this is an example of one participant. We get this kind of expected response from the NIRS data. So on the left side, we have three curves of the 5, 10, and 20% condition when the leg is occluded. We see they all kind of come down to the same minimum. They have maybe a little bit, steepness of the curve is a little bit different, but very, very similar responses with minimal time difference, actually, despite the intensity difference in the occluded state. In the non-occluded state on the right-hand side, you have quite a different picture because we have blood flow, and blood supply really can mess things up with NIRS because we don't really know. It's hard to determine what exactly is happening in an active system. But what we see is clearly there's a different amplitude of where SMO2 is going down, and we see that the activities go on much longer when the leg is not occluded, especially for the lighter conditions, so the blue and the red conditions, which are the 5 and 10%. There's some clear differences here. Now, if we think about our gray box model, the idea is still, if these tasks are all happening to failure, in either condition, we should have a battery indicator, or arbitrary units, that should stay somehow constant. Right? Battery's empty, you fail your task. And SMO2 is supposed to show us when our task fails. So we did some initial modeling of this, some very, very basic modeling at the beginning, essentially just deltas of SMO2. And this is what we get in these kind of arbitrary units. On the left-hand side, this is the modeling of the occluded, and the right-hand side is the modeling of the non-occluded. And the integrals here are identify this kind of battery that we have. And when we look at what these arbitrary units are in magnitude, we get during the occlusion over the three conditions, you get fairly similar values. Again, these are just arbitrary units, but the idea or the hypothesis was that all these sizes would be the same. The battery remains the same size. And in this occluded condition, it seems to work pretty good. That's not very difficult to see that it would be that way. If we look at the raw SMO2 data on the left here, it's basically the same curve. So, okay, we would expect that to happen. The right-hand side is very different. And what do we get out of our modeling? Well, we get this huge discrepancy. First of all, the values get much smaller. That actually happens with the W prime value as well. If you occlude and unocclude, you get smaller W prime values. But it generally being smaller values didn't bother me that much, but it's more there's a big discrepancy between the three. The battery size is completely different. So this doesn't seem to be very useful. So, well, we're doing modeling and we're using our gray box modeling techniques, and we can try a different model. So on the left-hand side here, we have our initial model, and on the right-hand side, we have M2. That's our second model. And we do some adjustments based on previous data, and you get a somewhat different looking model. It still looks quite similar, and there's a lot of change in above zero, so which would be like in recovery parameters. And let's see what that does to our data. So now if we go back to this looking at how big are these batteries then, we get our occlusion, which we said are the same. We get our model 1, which is completely different, and now we get our model 2. And our model 2 has already made significant improvements, in my opinion, to equalizing how big the three models would be, how big the three batteries would be, assuming that they should all be equal. These are our preliminary model steps for the idea to generate this gray box model that would give us this information about this relationship between the battery that I have available to me, the supply and demand of oxygen I have that's recharging this battery. And the end result should be when my battery's empty, I can no longer continue my task at the given intensity. So it should be predicting performance outcomes. I hope that wasn't too much. I think I maintained my time as well, and I hope it was clear for everyone. I can never really tell. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Andri. A great presentation and introduction to that topic. Do you have any publications planned for this topic?
Yeah. So this data is. So I'm currently writing up on we have multiple projects planned or multiple to do more data set. Cause I mean, basically the more data, the better. Sorry, Roger. I'm going to backtrack one. The problem that I have is based on all the data that I've seen over the years is that I think there's lots of pitfalls in this modeling. It's going to be very based on, so I think it's very possible to come up with a very good predictive model in a very tight area of use. So if you really limit the scope of where you're using it, I think you can get very good prediction rates, in my opinion, based on what I've seen. The broader you start taking the data, the harder it's going to get. And so I've planned multiple projects to kind of increase the different types of data that I'm getting. And yeah, there's publications planned. So we're working on publication right now.
Do you envision this being something that you would see in real time, or would this be an analysis that you did after the workout?
I think if it's useful, I think it should be in real time. Again, if I think the feasibility of that has to very much do with how tight you put the setup around what you're trying to predict. I think a broad prediction rate could be difficult.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much. Let's see, I'm not seeing any other questions come in. So if you have any additional follow-up with Andri, or you want to learn more about what he's doing with this model, certainly connect with him in the Discord chat. You can also check out his YouTube channel, like I mentioned, and I think you can connect with him through that. So thank you very much, Andri. We appreciate that presentation.
Thanks, Roger. Thank you, everyone, for listening.